Absolutely. That's great. Yes, we've had so much already this morning. And so maybe we'll move on to our next presenter. So we have Dr. Njabula Chipangura, and Njabulo is going to talk to us about Zulu art form and its influence in terms of decolonization. So Njabulo is an assistant professor of anthropology at Maynooth University, and his interest is in the ways in which museum practices can be decolonized through epistemic and aesthetic disobedience, benchmarked by undoing earlier systems of knowledge production and looking particularly at African collections. So can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you very much. I'm trying to upload my presentation here. It might take a while. I don't know why, but it's still showing that it's uploading.
No
Could have
problem.
done this earlier.
And it should be
But
available for sharing. I think it's set up that
yes,
way. Yeah.
yeah, I just got the sharing button with me now, and let me see what's going on. Apologies for that.
No problem.
Okay, it's still uploading. Anyway, my name is Dr. Njabulo Chipangura, and thank you so much for the introduction. I'm an assistant professor of African anthropology at Maynooth University in Ireland. I specialize in museum anthropology, specifically looking at African collections that were displaced and looted during the colonial period and found their way into European ethnographic museums, and how these objects are represented in terms of cultural meanings and other forms of representations. But the key point here is about what can be done to engage with African communities whose heritage objects are in European museums. And I work with notions around repatriation and restitution of these African cultural heritage objects through conducting collaborative provenance research with originating communities. So the paper that I'm supposed to give now is based on the work that I did with communities in South Africa in a place called Kwanongoma in KwaZulu-Natal. So before I was appointed as assistant professor of African anthropology at Maynooth, I worked at the Manchester Museum in the UK for about 3 years. I was the curator of African anthropology there, curating more than 16,000 African cultural heritage objects that were collected by the empire as it was moving and colonizing different African countries. So as I was doing this research and working and looking through these collections as a curator, I came across a huge collection of Zulu beads, or Zulu beadwork rather, and it came to me as a surprise that most of these objects didn't have enough contextual information, what we call provenance information in museum anthropology. Then I had to do some work with this community and a colleague. Okay, I think it's coming out now. It'd be best to speak to the slides, and then you can see what I'm trying to talk about in this presentation. It's excellent, excellent. Can you see the slides? Fantastic. So yeah, so this is the work that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to speak about how museums with problematic ethnographic collections that are in the global north can engage with communities, African communities, in the global south. So this is me, just a sense of where I'm coming from as a museum anthropologist. I'm currently working as an assistant professor of African anthropology at Maynooth. I was the curator of anthropology living cultures at Manchester Museum, which is part of the University of Manchester, for 4 years. I was once a curator of archaeology at Mutare Museum in Zimbabwe for almost 10 years. And I was a lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. I was teaching anthropology. I have a PhD in anthropology from Wits, and I'm the author of a book called Museums as Agents of Social Change, Collaborative Programs at Mutare Museum, which was published by Routledge in 2021. If you want to read this book, I can share. So I'm going to start with the provocation. Why do we need museums? What are museums for? And are museums necessary for societies, either they're in the global north or in the global south? But mind you, the whole idea of a museum is not just a global north thing. We have museums in Africa which were set up as byproducts of colonization. I'm going to speak about that as well in my presentation. So I read from this colleague of mine called John Slay, who wrote a book called What Are Museums For? I'm going to start off by saying museums must be for all people, and inclusion must be at the heart of everything that they do. Museums are supposed to be inclusive, and I'm going to tell you why I think museums are supposed to be for all people, and inclusion must be at the heart of everything that they do. So this is Manchester Museum on Oxford Road, a huge museum. It's the biggest university museum in the UK, with more than 4.5 million objects categorized across both what we call natural history collections and cultural history collections. So I was curator of anthropology at Manchester Museum, taking care of more than 35,000 anthropological objects that were collected from different parts of the world, and mostly from former British colonies from Asia, Africa, Americas, and Oceania. So within the expansion of the British Empire to these different parts of the world, which they were collecting objects from the people of Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. And in a sense, Manchester Museum is more like an encyclopedic museum with objects from all over the world. But the problem is that these objects were just simply classified, categorized as anthropological objects in the absence of understanding the social biographies of why were these objects made and how are these objects used within communities of origins. So subsequently, there's this idea of othering in anthropological museums where objects are simply seen as representations of people of the other. They're different from us. These are less developed people. Let's take their objects, let's rescue them, let's bring them to museums. But in this sense of collecting, the objects themselves lack social biographies or cultural meanings, which can only be located if museums like Manchester collaborate with communities of origins. What then is an ethnographic museums? So ethnographic museums are museums that essentially hold cultural heritage objects from different parts of the world and mostly from formerly colonized societies. So you have objects that are contained in ethnographic museums in Europe that came from the people of Africa, Asia, Americas, and Oceania, and also problematically so, ethnographic museums hold ancestral remains or what you'd call human remains of colonized people. So it's not only about the cultural heritage objects, you also find museums like Manchester still containing dozens of human remains of the people of Africa. And these human remains were brought in as trophies of colonial conquest. People who were resisting colonial rule were killed, and their remains were brought into museums for racial science and for racial profiling. And up to today, most ethnographic museums in the global north, they contain thousands and hundreds of ancestral remains from the people of Africa, which is very, very problematic from an ethical point of view. These are some of the examples of ethnographic museums that I've visited and that I've worked with in terms of looking for African cultural heritage objects. You have the National Museum of Scotland, you've got the British Museum, you've got the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is part of the University of Oxford, Manchester Museum, got lots of African objects, the National Museum in Liverpool, the Birmingham Museum, the Smithsonian Museum of African Art, Royal Museum in Belgium, Humboldt Forum in Germany, and the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. They also got lots of African collections. So a colleague of mine, Olusegun Morikinyo, who support me on this one, has been working on some of this African collection in Ireland. So ethnographic museums, as we see them in the global north, they're a representation of colonial violence because what we have as objects in ethnographic museums were collected during the colonial period. And these objects were not given by the African people willingly to the collectors. In most cases, objects were taken away and were looted without the consent of the people of Africa. So what then can be done to address some of these colonial ills that were brought by taking away African objects without the consent of African people? So in a sense, ethnographic museums are colonial legacies in themselves because they have been critiqued for their attempt to try and own and represent the world. Literally, they're an assemblage of material evidence and material culture of those people were colonized. So what you see in ethnographic museums are objects that are representing cultures of the colonized people. They also constitute one of the most tangible evidence of colonial violence. Because if you want to see colonial violence, you can go into ethnographic museums. Ask yourself, how did these 15,000 or more African objects get to be in Manchester Museum? And clearly, all of these objects are connected to colonialism because objects were brought into these museums during the colonial period. So what do ethnographic tell us? What do we know about ethnographic objects? Like this is an example of a drum. And this drum is in one of the collections at Manchester Museum. It's just a drum, as you see it. It's just a drum, but there's no contextual information on how this drum was collected. It has a label written Africa. And this is one of the problems with thinking about Africa as a country. Most of these ethnographic collections are only written, they were collected from Africa. But Africa is quite a diverse continent, very diverse. And it shows us how these objects were appropriated without the consent of the people. Because when people are just grabbing and looting, they don't worry about context. They just take things violently and then they didn't record the contextual information. So it's a problem that we need to grapple with in museum, that what is Africa about this object? Where do we start in engaging with this object in terms of undertaking biographical research and provenance research to try and understand where in Africa this object was collected from. So I'm going to walk you through some of the colonial collecting practices that led to the making of this ethnographic museum and how these objects came to be in the possession of museums like Manchester. So one of the most popular ways was a thing called salvage anthropology in the 19th century or 20th century, where most collectors thought that if they don't rescue African objects, they're going to become extinct. So salvage anthropology essentially means that objects were taken away from the people of Africa as a way of trying to rescue them from becoming extinct. Then with missionaries, we're also collecting from the people of Africa. The reason being they wanted to convert the people of Africa into becoming Christians. So as a way of trying to convert them, they dispossessed them of their own African traditional religious objects, which found their ways into ethnographic museums. And then we've got appropriation by colonial officers, violent appropriation, taking away objects from the people of Africa. Then we've got looting. One of the most famous example is the looting of the Benin bronzes from Nigeria in 1897 by the British. More than 5,000 pieces of Benin artwork were looted after the defeat of the Oba in 1897, and these artworks were sold to many museums, many ethnographic museums. Right now, the Nigerian government is demanding for the repatriation of these bronzes, and some of them have been repatriated, but most are still within ethnographic museums in the global north. And then we do have trophies of colonial conquest where ancestral remains, for example, were taken. People were killed because they were resisting colonial rule, and their remains were brought into the museums. Like in this picture that you can see here, there's some of the ancestral remains that are within the Manchester Museum. I'm not going to give you the count of how many there are. I might know, but for the sake of respecting these ancestors, we're trying to rehumanize them by not just thinking about them as human remains, but as people. These are ancestors of the people of Africa. They deserve to be repatriated and reburied in Africa as a way of decolonizing the ways in which ethnographic museums are taking care of African collections. Then we do have donations. I mean, sometimes you hear that people were donating their own African cultural heritage objects. And this is a popular way of collecting, but one must ask himself or herself, how did the people of Africa donate their own cultural heritages? What were the power dynamics between these so-called donations? And we're talking about the colonizer and the colonized. So there must be a critique on what it really means for museum to hold objects that were donated by the people of Africa. And then we also have got museum exchanges and transfers. So museums across Europe and across the UK, for example, they were in this kind of system of networks of exchanging objects among themselves when they were trying to do research on objects from the people of Africa. So these are some of the colonial collecting practices that are at the making or at the uh, birth of the ethnographic museum in Europe. Now, I was going to give you a brief of this kind of collection history of Manchester Museum, what it holds. So we have, or we Manchester Museum holds 15,000 objects from the people of Africa. They hold 7,000 from the Oceania, mostly Aboriginal communities from Australia. And then they also hold 4,500 from Asia. Then they hold approximately 4,000 from the Americas and a number of ancestral remains from the people of Africa, Asia, Oceania, and Americas. But for the sake of thinking about the ethical ways of taking care of these ancestral remains, instead of giving them a count of how many there are, the museum is trying to rehumanize and give them a bit of decent respect in how they're still being held in museums. But ultimately, most of these remains are supposed to be repatriated back to communities of origin. So the work that I was doing at Manchester Museum when I was still the curator there involved conducting collaborative provenance research with African diasporans, people of African heritage with an interest in these collections. So I was working with people, diasporans from Malawi, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Uganda, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Just for the beginning, I mean, they were not even aware that Manchester Museum hold all of these objects from Africa. So as a methodology, truth telling and accountability is one thing that ethnographic museums are supposed to do, to tell the people of Africa, either they're diasporans, how many African cultural heritage objects they hold, and allowing them to have access. This is where the whole point about inclusion comes into space. Museums are supposed to be for the people, and inclusion is supposed to be at the heart of everything that they do. So for museums to be inclusive, they must open up their collections to the people of Africa whose cultural heritage objects are literally imprisoned in storage rooms. So if the people of Africa are not told about how many of these objects are in museums in Europe, then they'll never know. A curator like myself, I'm supposed to be a custodian of people's cultural heritage, not an expert of everything. Curatorship has to be democratized to move away from the expertise that anthropologists hold in taking care of these objects. The word curatorship or curating comes from a Latin word called curare, which means to care. So the question is, what are we caring for as curators? Are we just caring for objects as things, or objects as physical representations of people's culture? Or rather, we need to extend the care to look at what it means to care for the people whose heritage objects are contained in museums. What then does it mean to care for the people of Africa whose heritage objects are contained at Manchester Museum? And one way of doing this is allowing them to have access to these collections. And traditionally, museums have been very exclusive. They were built on these kind of representations of people's culture. But now, in a decolonial moment, we are saying museums must be open for people, and inclusion must be at the heart of everything that they do. So I think about curating with care, which is an ethic of practice which respect the right of African diaspora communities by giving them access to these collections. Curating with care is also informed by, you know, critiquing how racism, sexism, and systemic injustices were responsible for the making of the modern day ethnographic museum that we know. So we need to critique all these colonial practices of racism, systemic injustices, and sexism that is still enshrined in most of these museum collections. That's what care means, critiquing some of these colonial collecting ways and colonial representations. So from the outset, we need to care about people, not just the objects. We must acknowledge that colonial violence played a central role in ordering collections in ethnographic museums. And we must look at the relationships that are within these objects and the people. So these are not just objects. I think in my own writing, in my own work, I critique the whole idea of anthropological objects. I think about them as living cultures. They're living cultures. Why? Because they're representing people's living practices. Wherever you go in Africa, for example, the objects that you see in ethnographic museums are still visibly there. They didn't die because they're in the museum. They're still similar objects that are being made by the people of Africa, which shows you that these objects are living. They were not meant to be imprisoned in a glass case. They were meant to be used by people in everyday ritual practices, in everyday daily uses. And this is where this whole idea of living cultures is cemented. They are not objects, they are living cultures that represent people's living cultural practices in Africa. So inclusion then means greater collaborations with communities broadly defined here as diaspora communities or African communities, and foregrounding their diverse perspective in order to reorder the ways in which these ethnographic museums, these ethnographic objects are configured in museums. So in that picture there, I am illustrating one of a diaspora engagement activity that I hosted at Manchester Museum. I brought together these African diasporans from Zimbabwe, from Zambia, from Malawi, from Nigeria, to look at some of the African collections that were in the collection. And through this open dialogue and engagement, they were able to tell stories on the meanings of these objects from their own indigenous perspectives. People were talking about indigenous languages in the morning and what indigeneity means. So for me, indigenous perspectives are a form of knowledge. Lived experiences can reconfigure and can tell us more about the meanings of these objects, which is actually more than just having these objects as anthropological collections. So if you want to decolonize ethnographic museums with colonial collections, one of the ways in which this can be done, or in the methodology, is through respective respecting different ways of knowing and doing, and respecting lived experiences of these African diaspora communities. That's how museums with collections from colonial collections can be decolonized. So there are things also imagining what research means by undertaking these kind of collaborations with communities of origins or diasporans. So imaginations underscores an engagement with big ideas that brings together people to tell stories and to explore important questions that can lead to conducting collaborative provenance research and object biographical research. Then what is this thing called provenance research, and why are I worried about doing provenance research in museums with colonial collections? So provenance research takes just more than tracing the legal history of an object, but rather is a quest to understand the underlying colonial collecting practices and acquisitions. It must be collaborative, working together with originating and diaspora communities. It's also a socially engaged practice that can transform the museum into becoming an inclusive zone of engagement and dialogue with communities of origin. I'm going to go to the example of a collaborative provenance research that undertook with Kwanungoma communities in KwaZulu-Natal in 2022. So we looked at a collection of beads that were collected from Kwanungoma in 1887, between 1887 and 1930, and they came to Manchester Museum through the Walker Medical History donation in 1949. So during this ethnographic fieldwork, we were able to engage with originating communities who are still making modern beads. And by doing this, the everyday uses of the beads were observed during the fieldwork. And as a result of this engagement with the originating communities from where these beads came from, Manchester Museum developed a new co-curated exhibition called Stories of the Zulu Beadwork. So this is just a map of the area where I undertook this research with communities called Kwanongoma. It's in KwaZulu-Natal, for those of you who know South Africa. So these communities are still making similar beads that are within the Manchester Museum collection. And this is the co-curated exhibition that just show the stories of the Zulu people. What are these stories? So when we did the fieldwork, we were made to understand that the bees, they've got different stories that they relay. And these stories include love stories. Beads are given to boys and girls as a form of courtship. Then you have ritual stories. You have cosmology stories. The Zulu cosmologies where the red, the blue, the white, the black, they represent different kind of philosophies around Zulu cosmologies. And then we have contemporary modern day beadwork, which are being used by these communities to, conscientize people on different social problems like the HIV and AIDS stigma. You have beadwork that has been used as, a way to try and conscientize people about stigmatization against HIV and AIDS. So these beads, they tell stories. They're not just objects when you look at them in the museum. But in Manchester Museum, literally, the beads were just sitting there as representation of people's cultures, as stagnant, as lifeless, as cold, as frozen. But when you go to the people, we get to understand more stories on the meanings of such kind of cultural heritage objects, which is a very important decolonial methodology. And then I'm just going to briefly speak about the other work that I was involved in at Manchester Museum. I spoke earlier on the Benin bronzes that were looted from Nigeria in 1897. So there's a mistake on the slide there. It's 1897, not 1987. So there are more than 5,000 objects that were looted from Nigeria by the British in 1897. Uh, the Oba and these people fiercely resisted, I mean, early attempts by the British to colonize the kingdom. But 6 or 7 British missionaries were sent to kind of scope and look around the Benin kingdom, but they were killed. So as a way of revenging the killing of these 6 people, the British sent a military expedition to Nigeria, which resulted in the disposal of the Oba and the killing of lots of people around the Benin kingdom and looting of more than 5,000 objects through this punitive expedition. So these objects were taken away from the Oba, from Nigeria, and brought to the UK, and were sold to many museums around Europe. And Nigerian government has been demanding for the repatriation of these objects. And some museums in Europe, for example, in Germany and the Netherlands, they've returned these objects back to Nigeria. But a lot more are still within European museums. So Manchester Museum also hold about 9 of these Benin bronzes, including this famous elephant tusk. So this tusk was on display for a long time in the museum, in the galleries, and it was just there, I mean, as a representation of the Nigerian, the Oba Kingdom, but there was no contextual information as to how Manchester Museum acquired this object. It was just a big, loving, loving elephant tusk, but nothing was given in terms of how it was acquired from the community. So when I was appointed curator in 2022, I said to my director, it's best for us to give a real context of how this object came to be what it is in the museum. Let's ask the people what they think Manchester Museum should do. So we did put a caption which detailed the whole punitive expedition of 1897, how this task as part of the 5,000 objects was looted from the Oba. And we asked the public, the visitors to the museum, what they think Manchester Museum should do about this task. And after 5 months of engaging, through written responses, 95% of the people said, please take this task back to Nigeria. It doesn't belong to Manchester Museum. It was looted, it was stolen. So from more of a moral and ethical point of view, most people are in support of the repatriation and restitution of unethically acquired cultural heritage objects from the people of Africa. So in response to this, we moved the task from display. It was taken down to the collection basement, and it's now awaiting repatriation to Nigeria as a form of engaging with the community. So inclusion can also mean that museum must tell their publics circumstances of around how some of the objects were collected. And then you see that truth telling and open disclosure will become a very important decolonial methodology. Another point about digital Benin material that is there uploaded online. So most of these Benin bronzes are available online. You can check them out. They've been digitized, and museums like Manchester and other museums in Europe, they submitted images of the Benin bronzes that they hold to try and make the bronzes accessible to the publics. And anyone can Google there and Google the digital Benin platform. You can find where these Benin bronzes are located across different European museums. But again, it's also a methodology that has been used by museums. It's called digital repatriation, of which it's not enough to just have them digitized and being brought up online. They must be returned to Nigeria. But as a starting point, I think digital access is a very important methodology to allow communities to know where these objects are situated within European museums. And then lastly, I'm just going to give an example of a successful repatriation exercise that I led on when I was still curator of anthropology at Manchester Museum. So in 2022, we conducted an ethnographic research with the Andiliakwa Aboriginal community in Northern Australia and Darwin. So this community lost close to 174 cultural heritage objects that were collected by Professor Peter Worsley, very famous British social cultural anthropologist who undertook his PhD in anthropology and he was looking at the Andiliakwa people in Northern Australia, their cultural practices, and he collected back paintings, magic dolls, fishing sticks, boomerangs, pipes, and baskets. So when he retired, he was a professor of anthropology at the University of Manchester. When he retired in 1949, he donated the whole collection of this Andiliakwa material to Manchester Museum. And in 2022, we decided to engage with the Andiliakwa community. When they saw them the pictures of the objects that Manchester Museum hold and gave them the agency to kind of think and decide whether they wanted to have these objects back or not. Because some cases we assume that communities want to have everything back, but it's not in all cases. Some communities are completely disconnected from these cultural heritage objects. So we gave them the agency, we gave them the access of the objects through digital prints and through pictures and showed them all these objects that were collected in 1949. And after some time, they wrote to Manchester Museum asking for the unconditional repatriation and restitution of all the 174 cultural heritage objects. It was a process, but eventually in 2023 in September, Manchester Museum handed back all the 174 cultural heritage objects back to the Andiliakwa people through an official ceremony, which was attended by some of the community representatives from Andiliakwa, and all the objects were taken back to Andiliakwa community. They're gone. This is an example of how some of the African heritage objects can also be repatriated back to Africa if museums properly engage with communities and giving them chance to know where objects are situated. Then the objects can be repatriated unconditionally. I'm just going to skip this because I've spoken about this earlier on. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to questions and engagements in terms of African heritage objects and what it means to work with collections from colonial contexts. Thank you.
And Jabula, thank you very much. I think we could have listened to you all day, or for longer, even talking about such an interesting and topical subject. So, can I just throw it open to the floor in terms of comments or questions or ideas, please? Hi, Kira.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think I was just reflecting on in the morning as well, the kind of the shape of kind of the cultural and the technology and the policy and sort of the different places where these indigenous knowledges and languages and language, but indigenous knowledge and its cultural context as well as obviously in languages and our policy around that. And I'm curious, sorry, just in relation to the kind of the practice of all of these works that everybody is doing and the social, I mean, I think people have referred to that kind of like the social engagement aspect of it and the kind of it's very, very relational, it seems, in terms of those collaborations and those relationships with and between our kind of whether it's our knowledge institutions or other structural institutions. And I'm just interested in any reflections in terms of those that nature of the sort of social engagement aspect of these practices of this work in relation to as well the kind of structural social structures that were and economic structures that we're all operating within in as well, also whether that's in a kind of local context or global context. So yeah, I'm just interested below in terms of when like those examples of repatriation and the objects going back and yeah, is that changing our relationships and our infrastructures, in fact, in a way as well? So it's a sort of broad reflective question rather than a specific. Thanks.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that question. I think the most important thing to acknowledge here is that, I mean, prior to this kind of socially engaged curatorial practices, most museums were very exclusive. They were just predicated on disciplines where curators were seen to be like the power and the authority on how to take care of people's cultural heritage objects. Literally, a curator was powerful. I mean, in most cases, I think curators are still powerful in terms of they have the knowledge, right, of conserving and keeping these things to live forever. That's what museums are for, right? They're keepers of objects to live forever. But the question is for who if communities cannot have access to these objects, right? So socially engaged practices are also a way of building real sustainable relationships with communities. No, it's not in all cases where these people would say, "We want things back." No, museums must not be scared of opening up their collections to the people. They must not be. Because, for example, in Africa, it's not every other African community that want to have objects back. Things have changed, right, over time. I mean, religiously and mobilities, people have moved away. Communities are not even homogeneous to start off with. They're different aspirations within a community. But the most important thing for museums is just to acknowledge their complicitness in terms of colonial violence and how they got these objects. That's important. And then they can go outside by engaging and showing people where these objects are situated. It's a form of building. For me, it's about relationship building. You are building relationships with communities in Africa. You are showing them what you hold. And from these relationships, biographies can also be kind of built in terms of the social meanings of these objects that are in museums, even in the absence of repatriations. Well, I'll give another example. Labels, some of the labels that you still see on museum objects from Africa, they're derogatory terms that I cannot even speak about now, but they're still being used on labels of these collections. So if you bring in someone from Africa into these collections, they can be able to kind of correct some of these offensive and demeaning labels, language labels that are on museum objects from the 19th century up to today. Most museums, they still have objects with offensive language, offensive derogatory. This can be easily changed if you engage with your communities. It's a way of building relationships, opening up these museum collections and allowing people of origin, heritage origin rather, diasporans to have access and to work with museums and building sustainable relationship that can correct meanings of these African collections. I hope I've answered you.
Great. Thank you, Njabolo. Two questions, one from Desmond, and then after that, Sheila. So Desmond, you're on mute.
Hello, Prof. And Njabulu, thank you very much for the presentation. It's a pleasure to hear from you. I'm very impressed with the work you're doing, especially with the research on the roots of the African artifacts in Europe, in the diaspora, and how we can link them to their original roots in Africa. My main concern is, I want to know from you, what are some of the challenges you faced in the effort of your work? I believe this is quite a very serious work, and then looking at the beauty, the aesthetic beauty of the African arts and crafts, and the current owners might still want to keep them. And I want to know from you, what are some of the challenges you face in your efforts to bring fairness and justice to the ecosystem in terms of art and craft? And secondly, I want to know, what do you think about the role of UNESCO in coming into play, especially in your work in getting those artifacts returned to Ghana? Because I believe those are some of the mandates of the United Nations in the spirit of fairness and justice. I believe if they can come on board, I mean, you could probably make some significant inroads in your work. So I'll be happy to know, share with me the challenges you face and the potential of UNESCO in coming on board to make sure that these agendas become fruitful. Yeah.
And maybe I'll
Thank you.
just ask Sheila to give her question, and then we'll throw them all at you, Njabolo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, mine is also a little bit interconnected with what Desmond has been talking about, and I've typed it into the chat box as well for anyone who can't hear me very well. I speak very fast. Apologies. Dr. Jabulu. Thank you very much for a really excellent presentation. I was so interested in it from a number of perspectives. I ask this question every time I go to a museum about what they are doing about repatriating objects. And sometimes you're met with a lot of scorn, like, why would we? It's so expensive. So much diplomacy is involved. And it's so expensive. So the last time I asked this question, I was met with, education is more important. We need to fund good education. And this is, so yeah, are you meeting with much resistance? And then in the mainstream communities as well, I've met with people going, again, the same resistance. They don't see the value of it. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, well done to Maynooth for that fabulous project on the beadwork. And it just shows what universities in Ireland can do as well. With our diaspora students and with our communities from Africa. So I'm just wondering, in terms of funding, how do we show the value of this when there's so many competing demands in what we were talking about, a much a much diminished funding pot at the moment. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, both Sheila and Desmond. Challenges, Desmond. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've faced during this week is what I call anti-repatriation rhetoric. Like, for example, there is this thinking that museums are becoming more universal. You know, like in the Universal Museum. So what's the point really if you have the Universal Museum, which is representing like all kinds of humanity? What's the point of returning these objects to Africa? The universal idea of a museum. I think your UNESCO kind of point will come into this as well, because there's this new thing called a universal museum or world culture museum or a global culture museum. These are new forms of museums that are trying to shy away from repatriating these objects, because they believe that they're holding these objects on behalf of all humanity. It's no longer Ghanaian heritage. It belongs to all of us as humanity. But it's a good point to say, but what about access to the people of Africa in Ghana? How many of them are able to come to the British Museum, which is a World Culture Museum, or to the Humboldt Forum, which is a World Culture Museum, or to Manchester Museum, rather? So that's a rhetoric. And another one is about infrastructure in Africa. There's this belief that in Africa, they don't have adequate infrastructure to kind of take care of these objects. If we return them back, they're going to deteriorate. That's a conservation language, you know. They'll deteriorate. But for me, I would say, why would they deteriorate? Yeah, these objects, they perhaps had lived since time immemorial in African communities before they were taken away from the people of Africa and brought to museum. Because for African people, it's not so much about keeping them in museums, or rather, they've got their own keeping places where these objects would also survive by being used by the communities. So those are some of the challenges that you face in terms of anti-repatriation rhetorics and anti-repatriation debates. Then Sheila, I think you spoke about the educational value of objects, because museums are for education, and these objects are used for educational purposes. Like, for example, the Manchester Museum is part of the University of Manchester, right? And much of these objects have been used for research purposes, theses, and so forth in archaeology, anthropology, and even physical anatomy. You see people still trying to come and do sampling on some of these human remains. This is part of what the museum is for. It's for education, public knowledge. So they would say that, why would we return these objects if they're serving an educational purpose within the museum? Right. And then the role of UNESCO is not only UNESCO and the International Council of Museums. They have been trying to kind of come up with position papers on how the repatriation of African cultural heritage objects can be undertaken. But before we move to UNESCO, I would think the African Union itself must be at the forefront of lobbying for the repatriation and also funding. I think Sheila talked about funding earlier. How do we promote and support this work, right? In view of diminishing funding opportunities, right? Yes, for you to do this work, you need to have money. For you to do provenance research and to engage with communities, there must be some money that is put. And in most cases, I'm sorry to say this, African countries are not committed to fund this kind of work. They are waiting for European museums to fund everything, which is okay. because these objects were stolen, right? But I think there must be some kind of commitment as well from state parties in Africa to lobby for the return of these objects by providing funding to do provenance research, to do biographical research. For the work that I did, Sheila, in certain this Manchester Museum, I got some funding from John Ellerman Foundation to undertake this research. So without funding, you cannot do this research. And I think for African countries that have objects in European museums, it's also important for them to kind of put some resources towards undertaking this kind of work for these objects to come back. And even if they don't come back, for them to know where the objects are. So I hope I've answered you, Sheila. Funding is a very interesting component of doing this work. We need to have funding, and this funding must come from somewhere. And for the African governments, for African Union, they must be very proactive in terms of funding some of these projects for people on the continent to come to these museums and to also see what these museums hold.
Great. Jabula, thank you very much for that advocacy and really interesting work. So we're a little bit behind time, but not too bad. So what I'm proposing, it's 11:35 now. So if we come back at 11:50 to start our workshop with Paul.
There's still two questions. Another question. All, yeah.
Okay, so
I don't know. Catherine, can I quickly come in there before you move on? I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm just conscious that we're a bit behind time, so.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. You see, I was just following up in Jabulu and the question of African collections in museums in Ireland. And this is a island as in the highland of Ireland. And the question of repatriation, restitution, and reparation. You see, I have done extensive research. I can say I'm the only African who has seen and conducted research on the African collection, both in Dublin and in Belfast. I see the collection. I've given numerous lectures on it, and I've done the provenance research. I've done curatorial history research on it. And the situation, if you want to describe the state of African collection in Ireland, because Ireland is in a very dicey geopolitical space. The most collections are collected under the, how can you say, at the back of British imperialism in Africa, but by Anglo-Irish personnel. You get what I mean? And since 1972, if you know the museum, I've been moved off storage. So to describe the African collection in Ireland, the best way to look at it is what is the problem of a finder keeper. A finder keeper, that is the key word. What is the ethical dilemma of any finder keeper? What do you do with it? Do you put it in your pocket or do you notify the owner? That is one fact of it. And on the great issue of restitution, there's a policy going on now that the minister should actually come back on what to do with it, how to repatriate it. But the onus is not on Ireland per se. The onus is on Africans to get this property back. My own research on it is self-funded. I spend money on it myself to fund it. Currently now, I'm working with the Royal Irish Academy to look at the provenance of the collection, because most of the collection you find in the National Museum are from Royal Irish Academy, Trinity College in, I think, 1876. So the challenge we have here is a challenge of what we call, how do we move from here? The obvious things to do for Highland, I've gave a lecture here at Trinity 3 or 4 weeks ago. It is the African, because you can't wait for the government policy. UNESCO, ACROM said, is a case-by-case basis. If people ask, you give it back. So the general, this is just an opportunity. I'm just to say to us that, look, the Irish government have to be made to understand that when when people demand or request the return of this object, it has to be given back. You get what I mean? Giving Irish own post-colonial history. So it's a very dicey one, and I'm happy Njabolo is bringing this to the table. But this is an ongoing process, and because here too, the object, it said the object belongs to the community. The collection in Ireland offers us a way to look at it, to start what we call forensic museology. And that is, the collection itself is forensic museological practice. Is what we are offered here in looking at the African collection in Ireland. I don't want to start another lecture here, so I will stop there and I will just comment in Njabulo for what he's doing, and hopefully things will be improved. Thank you very much. Sorry for cutting in, Catherine.
No problem. And I'm sure you and Njabulo hopefully will have an opportunity to deepen the conversation and to enrich all of us with that. So yeah, so just looking at time, 11:40. So if we say 11:50, I think I'll have to stick with that because we'll get very late otherwise. So see you then at 11:50. Thank you.